Don't Judge Others by Cindy Christmas. Read by Cindy Christmas. A long time ago, there were two brothers, Michael, age 9, and Thomas, age 8. The two brothers were so smart that their parents just knew they were going to have a bright future. Their mother, Mrs. Joseph, always bragged about how they were going to be either doctors, lawyers, or successful business owners. Michael and Thomas were also very lucky because their parents were wealthy. The two brothers were friends with Whitney, age 9, and Chris, age 8. Whitney and her brother Chris were not smart at all, but while their parents were poor, they were going to make sure their children had a good education. The Long family was always cheerful and kind to others, but their neighbors, the Joseph family, were very mean to them. Thomas noticed how his parents acted towards the Long family, so he asked curiously, "Why do you treat the Long family so mean when they are so nice to us?" "Thomas, you would not understand, but people like us should not associate with people like them," said Mrs. Joseph, grinning. "But why shouldn't we associate with them?" Michael asked emotionally. "Because we are much better than them, son," Mr. Joseph said proudly. "But Dad, our teachers say that we should be nice to everyone, no matter what. Besides, we like Whitney and Chris. They're our friends," Thomas said as he was about to cry. "Thomas, don't cry. You will get better friends who are as smart as you and your brother," said Mrs. Joseph as she hugged Thomas. "Yeah, way better friends, because if you hang around dummies, you will be labeled as a dummy. So it's best to stay away from them," said Mr. Joseph, trying to cheer up his sons. At school, Whitney and Chris realized that Michael and Thomas were not playing or talking to them. Instead, they were being very cruel to them, which made them feel really sad. When they got home from school, their parents realized that something wasn't right with them. And that's when Chris asked his parents, "Is there something wrong with us?" His parents looked at each other, and then Mrs. Long replied with tears in her eyes, "There is nothing wrong with the two of you. You are perfectly normal." "We can't be normal, because if we were, Michael and Thomas wouldn't run away from us like we are monsters," Whitney said as she began to cry. "Let me tell you all something. We love the both of you, and in our eyes, you are both perfect, and we see nothing wrong with either of you," said Mrs. Long as she kissed Whitney and Chris on their foreheads. "If nothing is wrong with us, why do Michael and Thomas say that we are illiterate?" Chris asked, teary-eyed. Mr. Long replied, "You are not illiterate. Everyone doesn't learn at the same pace, but we will pay for a tutor and you will be just as smart as the other kids. I want you to always remember that no matter how smart a person is, they still don't know everything, and there is someone out there that is always smarter than them." Mrs. Long smiled and said, "You are wonderful children, and I'm sure that Michael and Thomas would realize it and stop being cruel to you and start treating you like friends instead of monsters." Whitney and Chris smiled and gave their parents a big hug for making them feel so much better about themselves. The following day, Mr. and Mrs. Long went by the Joseph family to speak to them about their children's behavior towards their children. But Mr. and Mrs. Joseph were very harsh to the Long family. The Joseph family simply didn't care about how their children were treating Whitney and Chris because to them, the Long family were poor, unprivileged idiots. The Long family were very hurt to see how the Joseph family reacted towards them. As teenagers, Michael and Thomas realized that their parents were having some issues, which caused their father to move out, leaving them with their mother. Thomas and Michael took the separation very hard, and that's when they began to smoke and drink. Michael was getting into a lot of fights in school, which caused him to get suspended. Thomas was skipping school and going by females, but he started to panic when one of the females became pregnant. Thomas didn't want his parents to know, but they found out. With everything that was going on with Thomas and Michael, Mr. and Mrs. Joseph realized that the separation was causing their kids to misbehave, and it was affecting their grades. So Mr. Joseph decided to move back in. Although Mr. and Mrs. Joseph were not happy, they pretended that they were because they didn't want their personal problems to continue to affect their children. Surprisingly, when Mr. Joseph moved back in, within weeks, things changed. Michael wasn't getting into fights anymore, and Thomas had stopped skipping school. Sadly, the young lady who was pregnant lost the baby. The two boys were doing extremely well in school, but they were still drinking and smoking, but not as often as before. When the brothers were in their early 20s, their parents were very proud of them because Michael was attending medical school to become a doctor, and Thomas was studying to become a lawyer. The brothers couldn't wait to graduate and start making tons of money. Michael had many friends in college because he was very intelligent and cool, but his only problem was getting involved with the wrong friends. Whenever anyone was having problems, they felt comfortable talking to Michael, and he gave them great advice. One Friday night, while partying, Michael and some friends began to experiment with drugs. Michael knew it was wrong, but he didn't want his friends to think he was a loser. However, things went from having fun to frightening when Michael passed out. When his friends realized that he wasn't breathing and his heart had stopped, they rushed him to the hospital, but it was too late. Michael died from a drug overdose. Michael's death left his family heartbroken and in disbelief. It was really hard for them to accept the fact that he was dead. His parents couldn't understand why such an intelligent young man with a bright future would do something so stupid. His mother didn't want to believe that he overdosed on drugs, so she accused his friends of killing him because of jealousy. Mr. Joseph tried to convince his wife that no one killed Michael. It was just Michael's silly mistake that led to his death. Thomas took his brother's death even harder than his parents because Michael wasn't just his brother, he was also his best friend. So Thomas began to drink even more than before. The day of Michael's funeral, his mother and brother bawled while his father tried to hold back tears, but it was impossible. Thomas became very depressed after the death of his brother, and so all he did was drink. Thomas wasn't studying, and that's when he decided to drop out of college, which made his parents very upset with him. Mr. Joseph realized that Thomas was an alcoholic, so he tried to get help for Thomas, but Thomas refused to seek help. One night, while Thomas was on his way to a party, he fell asleep behind the wheel and killed an innocent pedestrian. Thomas was arrested for drunk driving and sentenced to jail for a year without parole. The Joseph family was shocked and disappointed when they heard the news. They couldn't believe their son was going to jail. Why are such negative things happening in our lives? Mrs. Joseph screamed. I have been asking myself the same question for the last couple of months, said Mr. Joseph, upset. What have we done that was so bad for us to be punished like this? Maybe we are being punished for the way we treated people like the Long family, said Mr. Joseph, wiping his tears. Mrs. Joseph sighed. Then maybe we should go over and apologize to them. Mr. Joseph yelled. Why? When we apologize, is that going to bring our son Michael back? Is it going to change the fact that our son is in jail? No. So I don't see the sense in apologizing. After that year, Mr. and Mrs. Joseph paid for Thomas's parole, which left them broke. Mr. and Mrs. Joseph had to sell their house and move into a smaller house because they needed the money. The Long family were watching the Joseph family move, which made the Joseph family feel ashamed because now they were no better than them. Thomas looked for places that were hiring, but he still could not get a job because of his criminal record, and he was becoming more depressed and began to drink, even worse than before. His parents were getting frustrated with him, especially his father. Mr. Joseph was so stressed out that one day at work, he had a heart attack and was rushed to the hospital where Whitney Long was his doctor. Oh my God, am I dead? Because this can't be real. Am I dreaming? Mr. Joseph asked in denial. Unfortunately, you are still living, said Whitney sarcastically. I deserve that. I'm sorry for the way my family were towards you and your family, and I know it is too late now, but I hope you accept my apology, said Mr. Joseph sincerely. Wow, you had to lose your son, your money, and almost your life to realize that you and your family was wrong for treating me and my family badly over the years. What a shame. But look at how the tables have turned. Don't worry, I forgive you and your family, and I'm sure my family will too, because one thing my parents taught me was to never judge others. While Mrs. Joseph was on her way to the hospital to see her husband, Thomas was at home cooking and drinking. Thomas went to watch TV when he fell asleep, and minutes later, the house caught on fire. When Thomas woke up, he was able to make it out of the house before the whole house went into flames. When Thomas called his mother and told her what had happened, she left the hospital without telling her husband because she didn't want to put any more stress on him. By the time Mrs. Joseph got to the house, the firefighters had already put out the fire. Mrs. Joseph cried until she could cry no more. Her sister took her in, but her sister refused to take in Thomas. Mrs. Joseph kept thinking about Thomas and everything else that happened, and that led to her having lost her mind. Mrs. Joseph was taken to the psychiatric hospital where Chris Long was her psychiatrist. She felt bad and ashamed to know that the same children who were illiterate had grown up to be so intelligent. Mrs. Joseph was so ashamed that she tried committing suicide by hanging herself, but she didn't succeed. Why did you try to kill yourself? Chris asked, upset. Why wouldn't I try to kill myself? Mrs. Joseph replied with an attitude. Chris smirked. It is not polite to ask a question with a question, so can you answer my question, please? Mrs. Joseph yelled. Life is unfair. My children were intelligent with bright futures, but my son is dead, and the other one is an alcoholic who can't get a job because he has a criminal record. Me and my husband are broke. My husband is in the hospital with a bad heart, and I am in here. And I don't know why, because I'm not crazy. Chris rolled his eyes and said, "You know, sometimes in life, when you do bad things to others, bad things end up happening to you. The negativity that you release, you will receive." Is this supposed to make me feel better? Are you trying to make me feel worse? Me and my family didn't mean to treat your family the way we did, but we cannot go back in time and change the past. Chris sighed. Me and my family don't hold grudges, and we don't judge others because we learn that no one is perfect. We all make mistakes. You and your family believed that you were perfect, and everyone else that was beneath your standards was imperfect. You and your husband didn't think that my sister and I were intelligent enough to associate with your kids. You tried to kill yourself because you are embarrassed to know that the child that you once called illiterate is now intelligent enough to be your mental doctor. Don't worry, I won't treat you the same way that you treated me and my family. Mrs. Joseph started screaming and yelling in the psychiatric hospital. Her son Thomas was admitted to the same psychiatric hospital the day that his mother was released. But unfortunately for him, he was never going to be released. Mr. and Mrs. Long's kids were so successful that the family was no longer poor. They were proud of their children because they turned out to be successful, and they learned that no matter how slow a learner a child may be, that doesn't mean that the child cannot grow up to be successful in life. And their children are proof of that. The end.